Good evening. My father was part of what is now known as the greatest generation, but it wasn't always called that. In fact, when I was growing up and a teenager in the late 60s and early 70s, we had a lot of names for my dad's generation, and none of them were greatest. But when I thought about his history, he really earned that adjective. He was drafted into the Army at age 20 and in 1942, and he ended up being part of the invasion at Normandy 2 years later in June of 44. And then after his unit had fought their way through France and been relieved and thought they were on their way home, lo and behold, they went through the Panama Canal and were taken to the Philippines, and he was in the Army in the Philippines for another 2 years, and in 1945 was on a ship in the harbor at Yokohama waiting to be part of the land invasion of Japan, which thankfully never happened because a few days before it was to be launched, the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended that war. So my dad came home from that war. He already had one son, and he put his business with his father, his construction business, back together. And he had two more kids, baby boomers, my sister and me, and I was the youngest. And as I said, when we got to my teenage years in the late 60s, he and I had the usual friction and tension between us that people of those generations had back in those days. But the one thing that we always bonded over and could always settle our differences about was sports. We both loved sports. We watched everything we could get on TV. We went to games. And when we were in that stadium together or watching on TV together, we were almost always rooting for the same team. And so it became a bonding thing for both of us. But the one sporting event that I remember most from those years was one that we could not bond over, and that was March 8, 1971, the first fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. And as you might suspect, with the generational difference between us, I loved and idolized Muhammad Ali. My dad did not like Muhammad Ali, thought he was a coward for having avoided the draft, and told me that repeatedly. So when the night came that they were going to fight, we couldn't afford to go to the closed circuit television version in Pittsburgh. We lived about an hour outside of Pittsburgh. But it was on the radio. It wasn't a blow-by-blow description, but it was a round-by-round summary given by boxing analysts. So my dad and I sat in the kitchen with the transistor radio on the table between us, and we listened to that fight, or the summary of it. And my dad had a little notepad in front of him, and I saw that he was taking notes. And I figured out about halfway through the fight that he was keeping track of who he thought would win that round based on the description that was being given by the commentators. And the fight was close, and it went back and forth, and there were rounds when it sounded really good for Ali, and there were rounds where it sounded terrible for him. And finally, in the 11th round, he was almost knocked out. He barely survived that round, and after that, he was barely hanging on. And in the 15th round, Joe Frazier finally knocked Muhammad Ali down. Muhammad got back to his feet and survived the round, but by the end of that round, it was pretty obvious that Joe Frazier was going to win that fight. And my dad showed me that notepad, and it said Frazier 8, Ali 6, with one round tied. And that's how at least one of the judges' scorecards came back. But all three judge scorecards were in favor of Joe Frazier. So my dad was really happy. I was in tears. And I spent the rest of the night in bed listening to commentary about the fight and crying. And my dad was very nice to me. He didn't rub it in or say anything terrible to me. And in the morning, he kind of gave me a pat on the back when he saw me reading about it in the newspaper. Didn't say anything. And so that passed by. And a few years later, I was in college, and we used to call and check in with each other once a week. And one week, I called, and my talked to my mom first, and then she said, "Your dad really wants to talk to you tonight. He's really excited about something he wants to tell you about." So my dad got on the phone and he said, "You'll never believe who I met in Pittsburgh yesterday. Muhammad Ali." He was walking down the street with an entourage of people with him and all this noise and everything. And I was on the opposite side of the street walking to the shoe wholesalers where I had to do some business for my shoe store. And somehow Ali caught my eye from across the street. And he called me over. And I went over and talked to Muhammad Ali and introduced myself. And he actually ended up asking me about my service in the war. And I told him about it. And he told me that he was very proud of me for having done that. And he said, and we parted ways, and he offered to sign an autograph, and I told him that wasn't necessary. I was just pleased to have met him. And so I learned something that day about my dad that I never had known before, and it really is one of the most important things he taught me. And that was that you should always be ready to change your mind. Thank you.